So it's a little after 3 here on the East Coast, and so let's get started. So I'm Jonathan Bagger. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the American Physical Society, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on anti-DEI legislation in Florida. And I'm especially pleased that this event was jointly organized by the American Physical Society, the American Association of Physics Teachers, and the National Society of Black Physicists. Diversity is a core value of each of our societies, and we know that many of our members are concerned how the new laws and policies in Florida might affect their classrooms, their research, and other activities. So today I'm joined by Beth Cunningham, the CEO of AAPT, and Hakeem Alushayi, the president of NSBP. Beth will introduce today's speaker, and Hakeem will provide final remarks to close out the webinar. And in between, I'll return to moderate the question and answers following our speaker's presentation. And for now, I'll turn the microphone over to Beth.
Thanks, John. As John said, I'm Beth Cunningham. I'm the CEO of the American Association of Physics Teachers. We're here today to help the physics community better understand the recently passed state-level laws in Florida regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. Since we're not legal experts, we can't answer all of the possible questions relating to these policies and how they might impact your work. But we know that you're concerned, and that's why we've brought together an expert to help explore what these policies mean for the physics community. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Katheryn Russell-Brown, who will talk to us today about the situation in Florida. Professor Russell-Brown comes to us from the University of Florida, Levin School of Law, where she is the Levin, Mabel, and Levin Professor of Law and Director of the Race and Crime Center for Justice. Professor Russell-Brown received her undergraduate degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and her law degree from the University of California, Hastings, and her PhD in criminology from the University of Maryland. She teaches, researches, and writes on issues of race and crime and the sociology of law. Late last year, she published a paper on the Florida bill, HB 7, the Stop Woke Act, and its impacts on higher education classrooms. And if you received the email, you have a link to that paper. So Professor Russell-Brown, it's your time.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity. A special thank you to all of you for getting this organized, to Drs. Julie Davis, Mark Elser, Beth Cunningham, thank you for the introduction, Francis Slakey, and Hakeem Alushayi. So thank you again. Kudos to all of your organizations for being committed to helping your members navigate through the rough terrain of SB 266. So this afternoon, after just some introductory comments, I'd like to talk about discuss 4 areas. Okay, and those areas, first, an overview of the law, overview of Senate Bill 266, a look at the hotspots of the law, the strategic responses and scenarios, and then the action steps. Okay, so first, let me just note the title of the bill, the title of SB 266 is Post-Secondary Educational Institutions. Now, the legislation itself covers a lot of ground. It covers DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. It covers curriculum and instruction. It includes parts on post-tenure review and also the establishment of various civic programs and institutes across Florida's colleges and universities. Our focus today is on the first 2 of these, and that's the DEI restrictions and looking at curriculum and instruction. Now, since this law went into effect, and that is as of July 1 of this year, and even before that, it has led to any number of questions about what it all means. And these are just a few of the questions that have come up as a result of the discussion and ultimately the passage of SB 266. Has DEI been abolished? How can professional organizations aid faculty and students in states with anti-DEI laws? Another question, how can our department encourage more women to apply to our program? And also with regard to curriculum instruction, when I teach, can I refer to sexism? Can I refer to racism? And so the goal of, or one of the goals of this afternoon's conversation is to answer some of these questions. Okay, so let's look at some parts of SB 266. And I want to note that while we're focusing on this particular law, there are laws and there's been proposed legislation in a number of states, in 22 plus states that have introduced anti-DEI legislation. Okay, so Florida is not alone. Okay, so let's look at, let's see, let me move this. Let's look at this parts of this legislation. Okay, so let's focus on initially on the anti-DEI parts. Remember, I said we'll talk about this as well as curriculum. So here are the rules. Okay, no state or federal dollars can be used to promote, support, or maintain any programs or campus activities that advocate for DEI. Also, that this law applies to Florida State universities, including those within the Florida college system, basically the public colleges and universities across the state. Now, there are exceptions to these general rules, and that particularly with regard to the first of them, regarding advocating for DEI programming and campus activities, student fees and university facilities can be used to support student-led organizations. Okay, and SB 266 does not prohibit programs, campus activities, or functions for military veterans, Pell Grant recipients, first-generation college students, non-traditional students, students from low-income families, or students with unique abilities. Okay, so we can see, so when we're talking about student-led organizations, that could be the Latino Student Union, the Blacks for Justice, I mean, whatever student organizations exist or approved to exist at a particular university, Women in the Law. So those are the student-led organizations fall outside of this anti-DEI legislation. Okay. Now, with regard to the part of the law that addresses curriculum and instruction, let's take a look. Okay, it bans courses that distort, and the quotes are from the legislation, significant historical events, bans curriculum that teaches identity politics, bans curriculum based on theories that systemic racism, sexism, oppression, or privilege are inherent in US institutions and were created to maintain social, political, or economic inequities. The law bans courses that advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and courses that promote or engage in political or social activism, and courses with curriculum that are based on labeled unproven, disproven, speculative, or exploratory content are best suited for electives or prerequisites for specific programs. Now, the main target for these bans on particular courses or course curriculums are focused on general ed, first couple of years of coursework. And the legislation notes that in some instances, some of these things, for example, with regard to the last one, that if there's material that's based on speculative content or exploratory content, that can be taught, but that it's best suited for advanced studies or specific programs once students get into their major. Now, I want to note that in terms of exceptions, so we've looked at that student-led organizations are accepted, and as well with regard to particular categories of students, there are exceptions. There is not language that allows for an exception in terms of teaching classes with some of this content, significant historical distortion of significantly historical events. And I note that because in prior legislation, and that's HB 7, which many of you may know as the Stop Woke Act, there was a language that allowed for the teaching of particular topic areas so long as it was done in an objective manner. And that language does not exist here, okay? All right, so in terms of penalties for violations of this, colleges and universities that don't comply or are not in compliance with SB 266 face a loss of performance funding and inability or ineligibility, I should say, to compete for state funds. Okay, so what are the trouble spots, okay, of the law? Okay, well, for one, there's an issue of language, right, and what the language means. So, for instance, what constitutes DEI programming? What specifically does that mean? The same for terms used in the legislation, social activism. How is it defined? What are identity politics? What does it mean to distort significant historical facts? Okay, and are there any exceptions? Now, what will happen, and has not happened yet, is that the Florida Board of Governors will provide some kind of document that states what the rules are and provide some definition of these terms. With regard to the law that I mentioned, HB 7, that went into effect last year, July 1, 2022, July 1, at the time that law went into effect, the Board of Governors had already made available information about definitions, but so we really don't know what these terms mean and how the Board of Governors will interpret what those terms mean. Now, I want to note as well that all of this is quite contentious. There's already been legal challenges raised to SB 266. There's a lawsuit by New College for Florida Freedom that's raising issues, constitutional claims about SB 266, including First Amendment issues, due process issues, as well as issues related to equal protection. Okay, so we have a lot of question marks, and these remain. So also part of what is happening around this legislation is confusion because we're not sure what these terms themselves mean. In some instances, and I'll speak for University of Florida, there are still chief diversity, we still have a chief diversity officer. And on the webpage, there's use of the term inclusive excellence, and the mission and statement includes the word inclusion. So what exactly is going on? What's now not permissible? Is it just a question of language? Some universities have provided greater, or some attempt to provide guidance to faculty members in particular. And I know the University of South Florida has provided some information specifically in terms of compliance with SB 266, but most people are just not sure what to do. And so this leads to really the core question, and that is, can you achieve the same programmatic goals that you had before the passage of SB 266? Okay. And I would say that the answer is yes, but it will require some different strategies. And there are some guideposts that we can use to structure programming and curriculum that complies with SB 266. Some of it will be about titling, how things are labeled, what is the name of the program. But another pillar is that these programs, these responses to SB 266, one of the things that it's clear through the legislation is open access. Like, there are programs open to students in general or for a select group of students. And depending on what that group is, it will either be compliant with SB 266 or not. Okay. All right, let's look at some scenarios. Okay. Scenario one, how could you work to increase the number of women in your program, in a particular academic program? Okay. What are some ways to do that within the confines of SB 266? Well, one response might be to create programs that address concerns that are typically heard from women students, or more likely to be heard from women students. Maybe a panel discussion of dealing with imposter syndrome. So the idea would be to address concerns or interests that specific students have raised, but that the forum itself is open to everyone. Okay. Another idea would be, as part of a lecture series, inviting women scientists who can tell their story, how they rose through the ranks of academia, for instance, in the sciences, and their challenges and successes, right? Or the 91st anniversary of Amelia Earhart's, solo transatlantic flight, some celebration of that. So those things seem like they are within the realm of what's permissible with regard to SB 266. So inviting speakers, acknowledging particular historically important dates, those things would be permissible. Okay. Scenario two, how might disciplines and professional organizations help members, faculty, and students who are in states that have anti-DEI laws? Okay. One response is to make funding available to students or to encourage students to attend national conferences where they'll be more likely to be exposed to approaches and presentations that they may not be in the state of Florida or in states that have DEI legislation. So just getting students into another environment where some of these things, some of these topics are discussed. Okay? Another is to inform students, and I should say students and faculty. Another possible way that professional organizations could help is to inform students about national or regional mentorship programs or affinity organizations. Okay, there are any number of these. There's Black in Neuro, 500 Women Scientists, Queer Scientists. So these are affinity organizations that students could be told about, notified about. Okay. Another possibility is supporting students to create a student organization, keeping in mind that the student organizations fall outside of SB 266 in terms of the activities and the focus of the organization. So for instance, a student for, an organization focused on Indigenous students in the physical sciences, right? So that would be a student organization that could be created. Yeah. All right, scenario 3. So what if your department or your college wants to invite students of color from a local middle school, and they want to invite the students onto campus to experience a college lecture and lab experiments. And so the goal is the long-term goal is to hopefully have students consider applying to that local department or college. Okay. Well, if it's just as I've stated, right? If it's just students of color in a neighborhood or local school directed, that sounds like it would run afoul of SB 266, right? However, if there is some way to have the programming rather than targeted to students of color, first generation students, right? That's one of the exceptions under SB 266. So programming or activities targeted to first generation students, or if there's some indication that a particular percentage or high percentage of these students at this local school are low income, that's another group that it's okay to target. It's okay to have programs around. Okay, so if so, then it fits within SB 266. Okay, another scenario, scenario 4. Let's see, if there was a course that someone wanted to teach, an undergraduate course that looks at fertility and medical history, one of the questions that might come up is, well, could we talk about, can we include curriculum on Henrietta Lacks, for example, and her HeLa cells, right? What about the sterilization of Black women and poor women? The testing of birth control medicine on Puerto Rican women, a close look at J. Marion Sims as the father of gynecology, who engaged in, practicing on Black women without, anesthesia. So what can be part of the curriculum? Well, this doesn't look to violate SB 266. This is not speculative. I mean, this is history. And so, but if there was some concern about it could be taught as an upper division course. Now, I want to note that the legislation doesn't take on directly scholarship. Okay, so if the question is, does SB 266 impact scholarship? We don't know. We don't know. It's unclear. They don't specifically single it out as some other legislation has, other outside of Florida. Texas, for instance, explicitly exempts research scholarship from these, from any limitations. Okay. All right. So let's move to the action steps. And before jumping into those, I want to say there are a few different approaches, and as has been noted at the front end, this is not to be taken as legal advice, but based on my information study knowledge, I'm sharing with you some ways you might frame or move forward based on the law. So, I mean, one approach would be do everything you can to adhere to the law and don't get anywhere close to crossing the line, wherever that line is. Don't even, don't get within shouting distance of that line. Another approach is to familiarize yourself with the law and act accordingly, right? And then the third is, as some of my as some people have responded, ask for forgiveness rather than permission, right? So do what you want and, deal with the consequences later. So I think, the second of those approaches is where many people are. They want to know what the law is and then, make a decision about what those next steps. So I'd say we're kind of working with that second approach. Okay, so let's take a look at some action steps. Okay. All right, so again, these are approaches, and I also want to note that it's understandable that people are concerned, upset, worried, anxious about SB 266 because there are many groups of people, faculty members in particular, who are vulnerable. That includes adjunct and other, non-tenured faculty members, but it also includes tenured faculty members who now in the state of Florida are subject to post-tenure review. Okay, and so this is part of, a larger set of steps that have been taken to that sort of, quiet or, the faculty voice. Okay, so put it in writing. Now, one approach to addressing a program, to planning out a program, is that before anything's done, that you prepare a, 1-2 paragraph overview of the goals and the specifics of the program, that this would then be presented. It would explain how your program complies with the law. You make explicit reference to SB 266. And this avoids and hopefully kind of moves us toward or away from, I should say, self-censorship, right? And so keeping in mind that you may be more knowledgeable, you may have more specific information now about the law than some of your colleagues. So because we, often talk in shorthand about, oh, you can't do this and can't do that. Well, there's room to do much of the work that we're already doing, even with the law. So, in my opinion, and so. One idea is so that your intentions aren't misunderstood, that you put in writing that you believe it is, it either falls within what you're doing, falls within some exception, or it's a kind of program that is already, that has, been found to be fine to have, and use that, those 1 or 2 paragraphs as a way to address any obvious concerns, which group of students, for instance, are coming to, an event or being targeted for an event, and then list and include in it a list of the ways that you might consider including within a list of the ways that the program will benefit your department or your university. Now, you may not feel comfortable writing something down at the outset, but I offer this as a way so that what your take is on the law is clear to the administrators in your program. Number two, request guidance. If you don't want to write something out, ask if there is some guidance. If there are some, framework within which you can do your work. Whether that's a conversation you have with your dean or your department chair, however that is. Follow the leader, and by that I mean, as I mentioned before, so for instance, UF has still has a chief diversity officer, and there's a web page, and there's all kind of activities that are showcased on the web page. So if you have if you have a chief diversity officer, you have some kind of activities that you can look to that already exist or are already taking place at your university, then you have a model to use for future programming. Okay. Another, present your case. So if you have questions about covering a topic or an issue in your class, particularly content for syllabi, and you're concerned about it, you can ask. You can kind of make the case. And certainly it ties to requesting if there's any guidance, but also you can again say why you believe what you are doing does not violate SB 266. Okay. The fifth one, the facts, is a hard one, right? Because part of what the legislation is explicitly designed to do, HB 7 as well as SB 266, is to say that faculty, instructors should only state the facts, right? And not our opinions. And so the question becomes, what if our opinions are based upon empirically sound data research findings, right? And so there's the rub, right? But if you're concerned again about where the line is, wanting to bump up against it or stand back, the general would be state facts, not conjecture. Okay, but I note that this is problematic, especially since your opinion in your area of expertise is based upon research. So I note that. The last two, 6, gathering data, I think this creates an opportunity, can create an opportunity for gathering data from students on what they need and expect from their academic program. So many programs are already doing this, but for those that aren't, you can use this information to help shape your programming, such as invited guests, such as topics and areas of discussion, as well as curricular needs, hearing from students as to curricular needs. Okay? And then the last, sharing your work. Let colleagues in your program know, let colleagues outside your program know what you're working on, in particular colleagues in programs like yours that are trying to figure out how to respond to SB 266 and find out what they're doing. Okay. All right, I'll stop here and thank you for your time, and I hope you were able to put some of the material we discussed on SB 266 to good use. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Katheryn. That was really Very informative, very timely, very useful. Really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with all of us here today. So we have a bunch of questions that have come in. Some were pre-submitted, some have come in while you were talking, and I hope you'll take some time with us to answer them. And so let me just start by asking the first question. How does one protect oneself against punitive actions in states where these laws are in effect?
How does one protect themselves from punitive action? Could you say the last part again?
So if you live in a state which has one of these laws, how do you actually protect yourself? I think some of your action steps have been addressed in that direction, but if you had anything to add, people would like to feel secure on their journey.
Yeah, and I think that's why, before the action steps, I kind of talked about, kind of a continuum of responses to these new laws and this new legislation. And one of the concerns, and I want to underscore, is about self-censorship. And I think, and I hope that going over some of the language of the law allows, people to see that there's room to operate. It's not, you can't talk about this ever. Now, there are some areas, and especially in HB 7, some topic areas that the legislation, lists out, whether it's affirmative action, reparations, unconscious bias, that, they don't want discussed as material that would compel people to have students to have a particular viewpoint. However, that includes, even with that, there is an exception, and that exception, which I think I mentioned in passing, says unless it's done in a way that is objective. So I think, going back to what you actually asked, the question raised, is that it's really protecting oneself is knowing what the legislation says. And that was why I was suggesting talking to other people and talking to administrators about what the plan is. So it's clear that you intend to and are wanting to be where and engage in teaching or programming that is within the confines of SB 266.
So thank you. Do you actually know of any faculty members who've been punished for running afoul of the law?
Not for SB 266, and the numbers that I've seen for the Stop Woke Act for HB 7 have been very small. It was less than 10, and I don't haven't heard anything additional. But and this ties again to the self-censorship. Once people are concerned that something they're doing might lead to problems, it's very easy then to say, well, I'd rather not. Now, I won't say easy, but there's almost in some way it's a push to not want to take on a topic or a program or an activity that might raise concerns, particularly for vulnerable instructors and professors.
I know that's a particularly pernicious part of this act. So people have asked, you've described the carve out for student organizations, but most student organizations have a faculty advisor. So can the faculty advisor be liable?
What would the scenario be? What would, let's see if we can create a scenario so I can answer something more specific. So if the faculty advisor did what?
Well, I suppose we had a student-led organization that was examining the Black experience in America or something like that. Then it was the students came up with the idea, but there's certainly a formal faculty advisor. Would the faculty advisor be in violation for what their students are doing?
And let me amend that, please.
Okay.
So quite often, the work that we do comes through federal grants, like say the National Science Foundation or NASA. So say, for example, it's a student-led organization, but they're doing it under a professor's grant and they're the advisor.
And so the question is whether or not the federal grant can have language in there that is where they ask you, what are you doing to support diversity, equity, and inclusion? Right.
Well,
And
exactly. Yeah. So is that a question or a statement? I'm sorry.
well, I was no problem. I was trying to tie it together. So, and then the question is whether or not the faculty advisor could support or suggest, or I just want to make sure I was clear on what you were ultimately.
Well, what I wanted to do is I wanted to set up a conflict between the rules and the exceptions, right?
Yeah.
So the rule says that you can't use federal funds. The
Right.
exception says that, you know, you can do it from a student-run organization. So if we have a chapter of the National Society of Black Physicists and we have a federal grant that supports this work specifically for DEI, and the Florida professor does this, even, you know, is paying for it, but the students are leading.
Right. Yeah, my take is A, we don't know, right? We just simply don't know. B, one of the issues has been with this legislation is, oh my goodness, Florida's going to lose so much in terms of federal funding. What's going to happen is, and that's going to make Florida professors less competitive or, you know, more likely to be denied because of this. Now, so what we don't know, because there's language in SB 266 that says basically, oh, we want to, you know, we want everyone to follow the federal rules, but there's also language in there that says the federal government can't make, you know, Florida do things that are against the law. So in terms of, yeah, I mean, I have to say, I don't think the answer is a clear one, but I do think that if it's a student organization, students are able to engage. But I think the key thing is what you're asking about. What about the faculty, right? And you know, how are they handling this? And I think that goes to, is the faculty advocating for something, or are they encouraging, or are they simply telling students what they are not able to do? And I think that's where the rub is.
Thank you. So other people on the line are wondering, actually, how can states tell the people how to use their federal funds? How can state laws restrict the use of federal funds?
Well, I mean, they can restrict what they allow to happen for their employees and for their students, you know, in their public institutions. So I mean, that's how. Just in terms of, you know, I do think a lot of the kind of ways around 266 are with regard to student activities, but as has already been noted, you have the interplay of students and faculty, and this you know, also extends to visitors on campus. Like there's this kind of concentric circle ring of ways in which people are touched. But I think at every turn, you know, the goals have to be made clear. And that's why, again, I'm kind of doubling back to, you know, writing it down so it's clear. But there's a lot of question marks. And that's why I was saying earlier that, and that makes people go, okay, you know, uncle, I give, right? But I do think that there are ways, because the state does not want to lose these federal dollars, but we're going to have to see. And I do think it will be a lot clearer once the Board of Governors provides some specific details on these terms and definitions.
Well, thank you. Even though it is a tricky landscape and it is confusing, you're helping us actually understand it. And so really grateful for that. So another hypothetical has come in. So imagine I'm a University of Florida professor. I've gone to a conference using state funds. The conference is in another state. And I choose to talk about DEI issues while I'm out of state, although I'm being supported by state funds. Is this a violation of the law?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's close to my heart. And that is, okay, so this ties to what I mentioned about scholarship and how SB 266 hasn't said anything directly about scholarship. This is the work that many of us do. And so this would be a big reach for the state to attempt to prevent faculty from studying an issue and then talking about it at discussing it at a conference. So just in terms of that, because I think what the core of the question is about the state fund. The state is paying for faculty to travel out of state. And so does that mean then that the state gets to determine what you talk about when you go out of state? And I think the answer, is a no in terms of the scholarship. And I also want to note, I mentioned that there was been there's been at least one lawsuit. There's been more than one, but one lawsuit filed on the issues of the First Amendment, due process as well as equal protection clause. And so the legislation has been challenged, but also HB 7 has been challenged, and there's been an injunction on carrying out these laws. So we're operating this world in which this law has been passed, but it hasn't been upheld as constitutional, right? So I just want to remind people of that. And I'm not suggesting, that you don't attempt to adhere to the law at all. I'm not suggesting that, but that these laws are raising all kinds of concerns, particularly constitutional concerns, particularly related to the First Amendment, and particularly related to free speech. So just doubling back to the faculty member who goes out of town. And so I also want to make sure to say that analysis is not the same thing as advocacy. Right, so I wrote a piece on HB 7 and have presented on, and it's a critical piece on the Stop Woke Act, and I presented it out of state. So I just wanted to make that note.
Well, you're a really good sport to let us just keep peppering you with these questions, but it's super valuable for us. So thank you. So I got another one here. So you probably know that the Department of Energy now, in their Office of Science, really the largest funder of physical sciences in the United States, they now require that all proposals have what's called a peer plan, promoting inclusion and equity in research. And so can Florida faculty even apply for DOE funding if they have to write such a plan?
Yeah, this goes back to the issue, right, of competitiveness, right? So, all things being equal, if you're in Florida and you've applied for grant funding and you have everything in order, but you don't have this DEI statement or this comment about how your work ties in. And I think that this STEM areas are, disproportionately, likely to have some concerns and being impacted by that. I mean, we don't know, and I read some about NIH has issued a kind of a very generic statement about they'll look and they'll read and they'll see just in terms of what how they would respond to I was just looking to see if I could find it. Yeah, they've got, as a federal agency, we have the authority and responsibility to assure that grant recipients abide by applicable federal law. Anyway, it goes on. But the point is, it's hard to imagine that faculty in states that won't allow them to make statements about how their work ties in or furthers concerns about DEI, how they will not be less competitive than their peers in other states that don't have the same rules.
But presumably, though, if when we're writing about inclusion or building the workforce of tomorrow that includes all of
Mhm.
the United States, you're presumably on safer grounds than you are if you're talking directly about race.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's interesting, if you look at the carve-outs, look at the groups, whether it's low-income students or whether it's students with unique abilities or students who are first generation. So it's clear that the legislature has said there are some groups we do think are worth our protection, just in terms of, or our protection, and I guess more directly our focus in terms of wanting to do things to support them. And so we can note that, but we can also note which groups are not included there as well, right? And so much of the legislation, especially HB 7, is tied to issues of how issues of sexuality and race are covered, CRT, in the classroom.
So that really leads really directly into the sort of the next question, because you talked about the specific carve-outs in Florida. Is the language being used in Florida a model for other legislatures? Is it being used, or are other states doing coming at this anti-DEI from a different direction, from other directions?
Yeah, so states are doing all kinds of things, and I think I mentioned that almost half of the states have either passed or have considered DEI legislation. And I noted Texas as one of those states, and I was interested in theirs because they had they allowed, specifically said that that the law was not tied to scholarship. But yeah, so states are doing all kinds of things. And I think, in some ways, Florida, because of, there's been so much legislation, there's so many other things that have been, that have been passed by the legislature. But Florida's not alone. I think if nothing else, we want to make sure people are aware that this is spreading outward. It's not only in Florida, it's not only in the South. And so, yeah, so it's here.
So people are also pointing out that many of the people who do teaching at universities are teaching assistants rather than faculty per se.
Vulnerable populations.
Right. Are the consequences any different depending on your title at the university? I mean, a graduate student serving in an instructor role is as liable as the faculty member, or
yeah, the language used in the legislation for the most part is instructor. So yes, that includes, that's why I was saying vulnerable populations, but you're right. So that would include not only non-tenured, under the broad category of non-tenured track or not yet tenured, but yes, definitely also graduate students as instructors.
And there's a very clever question here. Can the laws be used to address bias in the opposite direction from the way the framers of the bills intended? Can parents and students sue to make sure that slavery is described accurately, or that a state's history of racial violence is actually taught?
Yeah, it's a great optimistic question, and there's an article, a law review article that was written about, well, can't we we'll invert the laws and turn them around and make them address all of these other, issues in a way that's much more comprehensive. So I would love to see that. I would love to see that in action. And I do think. So part of this is, and some of you will remember, all of the attention and concern around how African-American studies can be taught in K through 12 in the state of Florida. And, some of you may have heard about, this language that suggested that, enslaved people benefited somehow from slavery. And there was all this, language that you're not supposed to use about systemic or institutional racism. So back to more specifically to the question, is while you certainly could create, a curriculum that sort of, in some ways, claps back at the wording of the legislation, but there are all these other things that are already in place that are kind of pushing a particular viewpoint on whether or not you can talk about it. Because, like, what is political activism? What is social activism? What is, what are identity politics? So there are all these other things that, that can weigh on how these discussions can happen, what the upshot is. And I just want to note, because I don't think that I underscored it enough, that the SB 266 is about post-secondary education. We don't know what's coming down the pike. Maybe the next one will be a broader expanse in terms of application. Like, for example, the Stop Woke Act is targeted at K through 20. Okay, but for this one, in the title for SB 266, it's post-secondary educational institutions.
Well, thank you. So I'd like to just squeeze in 2 questions in our last few minutes and then turn the floor over to Hakeem, if that's okay. But the first is that there are all sorts of programs that the American Physical Society, the American Association of Physics Teachers, and National Society of Black Physicists. There are all sorts of programs that we run to support really the diversification and increased inclusion in physics. And is it okay for people to participate in those programs in Florida, or
is it okay to participate in I just want to make sure I'm clear on the question. Yeah. In a professional
societies programs where we have a national scope? We are running these, or all sorts of people around the country and even around the world are involved in these, but they come right up to the line, or maybe cross the line, about the Florida law. So is it okay to participate, would you say? Or did it depend?
No, I want to answer directly. I don't see any language in the legislation that would suggest that you could not participate. And I think that would be shocking, right? Like, so now, if there are organizations that the state is saying you can't even join, and these are national societies. And that's not that is not my reading of SB 266. The focal point is on state funding and what the states, because one of the things that happened was earlier this year, there was a requirement that each university state how much of its funding goes to DEI work. And so the whole idea of the legislation was to not allow for that.
So this has been such a really rich discussion. You've brought so much information to us. I'm sure people are going to continue to have questions. And so are there groups or organizations of lawyers that really specialize in giving legal advice to scientists that people on the call could actually consult so that
that's a great question. I'm not familiar with a group, but maybe that will be one thing that can develops as a result.
Well, yeah, we certainly hope that
begin communication.
You'll start it. Thank you so much, and thank you for the time with us today. I'd like to pass the floor over to Hakeem. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to also add my thank yous to you, Dr. Professor Attorney Russell-Brown. And I'd like to thank everyone who has attended today. The best thing that we can do is to understand the law. And we definitely have the philosophy of turning to the experts, because we ourselves are not experts on the law. In 2 days, we will follow this up with another webinar, but this time directed at the entire country of America. And so we will be led by Dr. Jeremy Young of Penn America. So please join us. It's at the same time on Wednesday of this week, October 4th. So thank you all for attending, and please continue your excellent work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hakeem. Thank you, Katheryn. Thank you, Beth. Thanks to everybody who's on the call today. Look forward to seeing you Wednesday. Bye-bye.